Hi everyone, let's go ahead and jump right on into today's lecture. Today we'll be talking about variables, claims, and validities. So variables are a feature of a study that have different levels or values. That variables are just the thing that you're interested in studying, and they can vary. They have different levels. That's why they're called variables. A constant is something that remains the same. So we usually keep things the same or keep them constant in order to reduce confounds in our study. So I'm going to try to illustrate this with a little example here. Let's say it's also important to define our variables and be very specific about how we measure them. So, a conceptual definition of a variable tells you what the concept is, what it means, and the operational definition tells you how to measure it. It's very important that to be very specific about how you operationalize your variable, meaning how you describe how it's going to be measured. This is especially true in psychology because we're often measuring abstract concepts like happiness, well being, self esteem. So, how do you really measure that? In this example that we have, so our conceptual idea is plant growth, and I could operationalize by saying, I'll measure the height of the plant measured in inches every 2 days. That is a very specific measurement. Of course, there's different ways that I can operationalize this. I can use a different type of measurement. I can measure the width. I can measure just the leaves, the amount of leaves. So there's different ways to operationalize any given variable. So you have to be very specific about how you're going to do that in your study. So moving on now, we're going to talk about claims. So there's three claims we're going to discuss. A claim is just an assertion or an argument that can be based on evidence, it can be based on observations or anecdotes. The three types of claims we'll be discussing are frequency claims, association claims, and causal claims. Frequency claims tell us how often or the degree to which something is occurring. Frequency claims typically include one variable that's measured, so there's no manipulation involved. For example, we have claims here that say the average American eats 20 quarts of ice cream per year. So that's one variable that's being measured is the amount of ice cream consumed. And this other example says 91.5% of children age 19 to 35 months receive the MMR vaccine. So this is looking at percentage of children receiving a vaccine. So language to look out for when identifying frequency claims include things like percentage, degree, the number or the rate at which something is happening. Association claims tell us how two or more variables are related to each other. We might see language like related, linked, correlated, associated with, things like that. Here are some examples. Eating ice cream is linked to positive mood, or children who receive vaccines are more likely to be diagnosed with autism spectrum disorder. So these there's different types of associations. Associations can be positive or negative. We typically can use scatter plots as a graphical way to represent associations. So this it just means that one variable could be plotted on each axis, and then we look at the slope or the direction of the association. So I'm about to show you what those can look like. So here's an example of a positive association or positive correlation. This just means that the two variables vary or change in the same direction, in the same manner. So here, low scores on shyness correlate to a lower ability to read facial expressions. I could also interpret this as the more shy someone is, so higher scores on shyness, is linked to the greater ability to read facial expressions. So high scores on one variable equals high scores on another, and likewise for low scores. Here's an example of a negative association, also referred to as an inverse association or inverse relationship. And this is when high scores go with low scores and low scores go with high scores. And then here's how we can tell if there's no association between the variables when all levels of one variable are associated with all levels of another variables. There's no correlation, no discernible pattern to the association. Moving on now to causal claims. Causal claims are claims that argue that one variable is responsible for changes in another variable. These types of claims use definitive language like cause, predict, prevent, reduce. For example, eating ice cream leads to happy mood and positive emotion, or vaccines cause autism spectrum disorder in children. So you have to be very careful when making a causal claim. And also, if you see a claim or a headline or someone saying that something causes something, I'm going to give you some tools to evaluate, because you have to be really critical about that. In order to make a causal claim, there's 3 criteria that must be met. So here we have a causal claim that says increases in ice cream consumption causes greater rates of violence. So we have 2 variables, variable A and B. Variable A is ice cream, variable B is violence, and we're making the claim that eating ice cream or increases in ice cream consumption directly lead to violence, greater rates of violence. So here are the 3 criteria for a causal claim. One is covariance. The variables have to co-vary. Co means together, vary means change. So they have to change together, and changes in one variable must coincide with changes in another. If one variable is remaining the same, then you can't possibly say that one change causes change in the other. The next criteria is temporal precedence. Temporal refers to time. Precedence means to come before. So A must come before B. Otherwise, it's just an association. You can't say that A causes B if A didn't happen before B. So you have to establish that. And often you can't really establish that unless you do some type of manipulation, like in an actual experiment. And lastly, is we have internal validity. Internal validity is the extent to which you can control for confounds. Confounds are other variables that might also influence your outcome or influence variable B. Sometimes this is also referred to as the third variable. For example, hot weather could be our confound. So maybe it's the case that when it's hot, people are more aggressive, which might lead to more violence. And it just so happens that when it's hot, people tend to eat more ice cream. So how can we be sure that it's ice cream that leads to violence when I have this other variable that could also be causing the increase in violence? Unless you control for that variable, either in your experiment or statistically, you cannot make that causal claim. So again, looking at association and causal claims, association describes the relationship between 2 variables, but their variables are at the same level. Whereas causal claims suggest a directional relationship between 2 variables and can only really be supported by an experimental design. You can't make a causal claim unless you systematically control for confounds and that you establish temporal precedence and you have control over your variables. So we use cause very willy-nilly. We often, causal claims are made without support, but I just wanted to emphasize that it's very hard to make an actual causal claim. So when you see headlines or research saying that something causes something else, you want to be very critical of that. So here is workshop number 3. Just a reminder, you should be completing all of the workshops. If you plan to submit this one for credit, you can upload your responses to iCollege in the corresponding assignment folder. So go ahead and hit pause so you can do the workshop and maybe even take a break before we move on to the next topic. Okay, so we've talked about the 3 claims. Now we'll talk about how to assess those claims or evaluate them using the 4 big validities. So the first type of validity is construct validity. This refers to the quality of our measures and our manipulations. The statistical validity refers to whether or not our statistical conclusions are appropriate and reasonable. We want to make sure that we don't have errors in our statistics, and we want to make sure that our results are statistically significant. External validity refers to how we can generalize our findings. So we often use a sample in our research studies, and we want that sample to generalize to a bigger population. So are these findings from our study applicable or generalizable to a bigger group or a bigger population? Internal validity, we just talked about, is a requirement for causal claims. We want to make sure that we reduce or eliminate our confounds in the study so that there are no alternative causal explanations for the outcomes or for our results. Now, internal and external validity often come at a trade off. If you have really good internal validity, you are likely jeopardizing or minimizing your external validity because you've controlled for so many factors that it may not be as generalizable, at least not to a much larger population. And if you prioritize external validity, you are most likely sacrificing controlling for a lot of confounds in the study, which limits your ability to make causal claims. So, if we ask a question of which one of these four big validities is the most important, that will depend on the claim. So, now I'm going to go through each of the three claims and explain how we can evaluate each depending on the validity. So, first, we're going to talk about frequency claims. So these are, if you're looking at a frequency claim, these are the types of questions you'd want to ask. So for construct validity, you want to know how the variable was measured. In other words, how did they collect this data? Did they use word of mouth? Did they use a survey? Was it a phone survey? What types of questions they asked? These would get at the construct validity. The statistical validity, a question that might come up is how large is the margin of error? So I want to know whether or not the sampling error played a role in the statistical analysis. For external validity, which is the most important issue here when we're talking about frequency claims, I want to know if we can generalize from the sample to a larger population. So in order to evaluate this, I might think about things like, well, who was sampled in order to come up with this frequency claim? So in the example that I have at the bottom about the average American eating 20 quarts of ice cream, I would want to know who was included in this survey to get this result. Did they sample Americans from the South, Americans on the East Coast? What age range of Americans did they sample? And so all of these questions would help me to get at external validity, which is, to whom do these results apply? Internal validity is not necessarily relevant here because, again, this is not a causal claim, and it's not an experiment where I'm manipulating any variables. So for association claims, here are some of the types of questions that I might ask. So for construct validity, I'm looking at how well each variable was measured because, again, in association claims, there's two or more things being related. So I'm going to look at how each variable is measured. In this example, I would look at, how did they measure eating ice cream and how did they measure positive mood? For statistical validity, that's most important for association claims. The questions here would be how strong is that association and is it statistically significant? So two variables can be associated but still not be statistically significant. So that's important to consider here. For external validity, again, I'm thinking about to whom I can generalize the findings or the results. And then internal validity is not a priority because, again, you're not making a causal claim. You can still think about other variables that could be implicated in this association, but because you're not saying that A causes B, internal validity is not necessarily a priority. Now, looking at causal claims, the first thing here is that it has to be an experiment or some type of controlled environment. That's really the only way that you can make a causal claim is by really controlling for temporal precedence, controlling for third variables, and making sure that you can say that A causes B. So in terms of the validities, I'm going to think about construct validity. I want to know how well the independent variable is manipulated and how well the dependent variable is measured. So in the claim that I have here where I'm saying eating ice cream prevents sadness, I would want to know how I manipulated the independent variable would be eating ice cream. So how did I manipulate that? Did I have some participants eat ice cream and some not? Did I vary the level of ice cream that people ate? And then in terms of the dependent variable, that's sadness or mood, how did I measure that? Did I do a survey? Did I do observations? It's important to know how you operationalize your variables for construct validity. Statistical validity, again, I'm thinking about the significance and the size of the effect. External validity is not necessarily a priority in experiments because, again, you know that you're making a trade-off with internal validity. Internal validity is a high priority for causal claim. Again, we've talked about that. If there is a third variable, then you can't really say that one thing causes the other. You can't necessarily make a causal claim if you don't have internal validity. So I'm going to just walk through this just as an example and think out loud about a lot of the concepts that we've talked about in this lecture so you can see how they might be applied. So let's look at this claim. It says, a recent survey study of young adult men showed that there was a positive relationship between corporal punishment and anxiety and mood disorders, including major depression, panic disorder, and PTSD. So, what are some things to consider here? First of all, I'm going to think about what type of claim is being made. And if I'm looking for clues, I see word like positive relationship. That indicates that this might be an association claim. Again, that's the relationship between two or more variables. So, speaking of variables, what are the variables here? I see that we're looking at corporal punishment and anxiety and mood disorders. So, this is considering how those two variables are linked. And I'm going to think about what the constants might be. If I'm looking at the constants, I'm looking for something that is the same throughout the study. And so that might be the population. So I'm seeing that they're looking only at young adult men in this study. So that's a constant. In terms of the validities, I would be concerned with construct validity. I would want to know how did they measure these variables? I see that it's a survey, so I'd want to know what type of questions were used on the survey and were those questions previously validated in order to measure these specific variables. Since it's an association claim, I would mostly be concerned with statistical validity. It says that there's a positive association. I want to understand how strong that association is and if it's statistically significant. I would also be concerned with external validity. So who do these findings apply to? It says that they used young adult men. So I would want to know, were these men in this study, were they from a certain age range? Were they from a certain ethnic background, a certain level of education? These types of questions will help me assess, can I generalize these findings to young adult men that I know or young adult men in a certain context. So that helps me get at the external validity. I wouldn't necessarily be concerned with internal validity here because it's not an experiment, it's not making a causal claim. So here is the second part of workshop number 3. I just want to point out that there is a bonus question on this one. So if you do submit this workshop as one of your required 4, and you also get the bonus question correct, you will earn 1 extra credit point. All right, so that's it for today. Hope you enjoyed. And if you have any questions, please be sure to email me.